All right, Menachot 45. A would be the front of the page. B would be the back, I guess. 45a. The Gemara asks, the Mishnah mentioned rams, in plural. On which festival are multiple rams offered? If the Mishnah is referring to the additional offerings sacrificed on those days of the new moon and Shavuot, as prescribed in the book of Numbers, these offerings include only one ram and not two. Here, let me back up. If the Mishnah is referring to the additional offerings sacrificed on those days of the new moon and Shavuot, as prescribed in the book of Numbers, these offerings include only one ram and not two. And if it is referring to the two rams of Shavuot that accompany the two loaves, as prescribed in Leviticus, a term of being is written about them in the verse. They shall be a burnt offering to the Lord. Leviticus 23:18. This term indicates that the offerings must be sacrificed exactly as prescribed in order to be valid. Consequently, one may not sacrifice fewer than two rams. The Gemara answers, actually, it is referring to the two rams of Shavuot that are prescribed in Leviticus, and this is what the Mishnah is saying. Failure to sacrifice the rams that accompany the two loaves, as prescribed in Leviticus, does not prevent the sacrifice of the ram of the additional offering prescribed in the book of Numbers. Similarly, failure to sacrifice the ram of the additional offerings prescribed in the book of Numbers does not prevent the sacrifice of the rams that accompany the two loaves, as prescribed in Leviticus. The Gemara challenges, but if that is the explanation, then when the Mishnah mentions bulls and sheep, it means that even the bulls or sheep of the additional offering prescribed in the book of Numbers do not prevent each other from being sacrificed, i.e., the inability to sacrifice one of the bulls or sheep does not prevent one from sacrificing the rest. But when the Mishnah mentions rams, it is the rams mentioned here in Leviticus that do not prevent sacrifice of the rams mentioned there in Numbers, and vice versa. But the failure to sacrifice one of those rams in Leviticus does not prevent sacrifice of the other. Consequently, although the Mishnah mentions bulls, rams, and sheep together, the halakha is not the same with regard to those different animals. The Gemara responds, the Tana of the Mishnah teaches each statement individually, i.e., the halakha applies to each of the animals listed in a different manner. The Gemara cites a Bereta with regard to the offering sacrificed on the new moon. The verse states, and on the day of the new moon, a young bull without blemish, and 6 lambs and a ram, they shall be without blemish. Ezekiel 46:6. The Bereta asks, why does the verse state a bull when the verse in the Torah requires 2 bulls, as it is stated, and on your new moons you shall present a burnt offering to the Lord, 2 young bulls and 1 ram, 7 lambs of the first year without blemish. Numbers 28:11. The Bereta answers, since it is stated in the Torah with regard to the offering of the new moon, 2 young bulls, one might think that it is not acceptable to bring fewer than 2 bulls under any circumstances. From where is it derived that if one did not find 2 bulls, he brings 1? Therefore, the verse states, a young bull, in the singular, to teach that even if one has only 1 bull, it should be sacrificed. The Baraita discusses the continuation of the verse in Ezekiel, which mentions 6 lambs. Why does this verse state only 6 lambs when the verse in the Torah requires 7? The Baraita answers, since it is stated in the Torah with regard to the offering of the new moon, 7 lambs, one might think that it is not acceptable to bring fewer than 7 lambs under any circumstances. From where it is derived that if one did not find 7 lambs, he should bring 6. Therefore, the verse in Ezekiel states 6 lambs, to teach that in the absence of all 7 lambs, one should sacrifice 6. And from where is it derived that if he did not find 6 lambs, he should bring 5? And that if he did not find 5 lambs, he should bring 4? And if he did not find 4 lambs, he should bring 3? And that if he did not find 3 lambs, he should bring 2? And that if he could not find even 2 lambs, he should bring even 1 lamb? Therefore, the next verse in Ezekiel states, and for the lambs as his means suffice. Ezekiel 46:7, indicating that one should bring however many lambs one is able to bring. The Gemara asks, but once this is written, why do I need the previous verse to state 6 lambs, indicating that if one does not have 7 lambs, he should bring 6? The Gemara answers, it teaches that although the minimal obligation is satisfied with even 1 lamb, nevertheless, to the degree that it is possible to seek more lambs, we seek them. The Gemara presents another halakha derived from these verses. And from where is it derived that failure to slaughter some of the required 2 bulls and 7 sheep of the additional offering on Shavuot prevents fulfillment of the mitzvah with the others? The Gemara answers that the verse states, they shall be, Numbers 28:31. The term, they shall be, indicates that the offerings must be brought precisely as prescribed. The Gemara discusses the meaning of another difficult verse in Ezekiel. So says the Lord God, in the 1st month, on the 1st day of the month, you shall take a young bull without blemish, and you shall purify the sanctuary. Ezekiel 45:18. The Gemara asks, since this verse speaks of the 1st of Nisan, which is a new moon, why does it state, you shall purify, hitita, which indicates the sacrifice of a sin offering, hatat, when in fact each of the 2, the bulls sacrificed on the new moon, is a burnt offering? See Numbers 28:11. Rabbi Yohanan says, this passage is indeed difficult, and in the future Elijah the prophet will interpret it. Rav Ashi says, it is possible to explain that this verse is not referring to the additional offering sacrificed on the new moon, but rather to the offerings of the inauguration that they sacrificed later in the days of Ezra, similar to the offerings that were sacrificed during the period of inauguration of the tabernacle in the days of Moses. When the temple service was restored in the Second Temple, the Jewish people observed 8 days of inauguration, initiating the priests in the temple service. From the 23rd of Adar through the new moon of Nisan, during these 8 days they offered a bull for a sin offering in addition to the offerings of the inauguration, just as had been done at the inauguration of the tabernacle. See Leviticus 9:2. The Gemara comments that this discussion with regard to the interpretation of the verse in Ezekiel is also taught in a Bereta. Rabbi Yehuda says, this passage is indeed difficult, but in the future Elijah the prophet will interpret it. Rabbi Yosei said to Rabbi Yehuda, this verse is referring to the offerings of the inauguration that they sacrificed later in the days of Ezra, similar to the offerings that were sacrificed during the period of inauguration in the days of Moses. Rabbi Yehuda said to Rabbi Yosei, May your mind be at ease as you have put my mind at ease with this interpretation of the verse. The Gemara discusses the meaning of another difficult verse in Ezekiel. The priest shall not eat of anything that dies of itself or is torn, whether it be fowl or beast. Ezekiel 44:31. The Gemara asks, is it only the priest who may not eat an unslaughtered animal carcass or an animal that was torn and now has a wound that will cause it to die within 12 months, tarifa? But an ordinary Jew may eat them. In fact, these items are prohibited for consumption by all. Rabbi Yohanan says, this passage is indeed difficult, but in the future Elijah the prophet will interpret it. Ravina said that it was necessary for the verse to emphasize that these prohibitions apply to priests for the following reason. It might enter your mind to say that since pinching is permitted with regard to priests, therefore an animal carcass or a tarifa should also be permitted for them. A bird sin offering is killed by a priest pinching the nape of its neck. This is not a valid method of slaughter and would generally render a bird or animal an unslaughtered carcass. Yet the priests are permitted to partake of the bird sin offering. Consequently, one might think that the prohibitions against eating an animal carcass or a tarifa in general do not apply to priests. Therefore, the verse teaches us that these prohibitions apply to priests as well. The Gemara discusses the meaning of another difficult verse in Ezekiel. And so shall you do on the 7th of the month for every one that errs, and for him that is simple, so shall you make atonement for the house. Ezekiel 45:20. The Gemara asks, what is the meaning of the expression on the 7th of the month? There are no special offerings that are sacrificed on the 7th day of any month. Rabbi Yohanan says, the verse must be reinterpreted as referring to the bull for an unwitting communal sin, which is brought when the majority of the Jewish people have sinned as a result of following a mistaken ruling of the Sanhedrin. These 7 alluded to in the verse are 7 tribes who sinned. In such a case, a bull for an unwitting communal sin is brought even though the number of individuals who sinned are not the majority of the congregation. Because the majority of the individuals in the majority of the tribes have sinned, it is considered a sin of the congregation and not sins of many individuals. Similarly, the word month, Hodesh, is to be interpreted as meaning that a bull for an unwitting communal sin is brought if the court innovated, Hiddishu, a new halakha contradicting the Torah. E.g., if they said that eating forbidden fat is permitted. The continuation of the verse, for everyone that errs and for him that is simple, teaches that the Sanhedrin is liable to sacrifice the bull for unwitting communal sin only for a matter that was hidden from the Sanhedrin, i.e., about which the Sanhedrin issued a mistaken ruling, and accompanied by unwitting action by the majority of the community who relied on the mistaken ruling. The Gemara concludes the discussion of the specific difficult verses in Ezekiel with the following general statement. Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, that man is remembered for good, and Hanina ben Hizkiah is his name. As were it not for him, the book of Ezekiel would have been suppressed and not included in the biblical canon, because various details of its contents appear to contradict statements of the Torah. What did Hanina ben Hizkiah do? He brought up to his upper story 300 jugs, garbe, of oil for light, so that he could study even at night. And he sat isolated in the upper story and did not move from there until he homiletically interpreted all those verses in the book of Ezekiel that seem to contradict verses in the Torah. The Mishnah teaches that Rabbi Shimon says, if the temple treasurers had sufficient funds for the numerous bulls that are required to be sacrificed on that day, but they did not also have sufficient funds for the accompanying libations, they should rather bring one bull and its libations, and they should not sacrifice all of them without libations. No. Concerning this, the sages taught in a Bereta. The verse states, and he shall prepare a meal offering, an ephah for the bull, and an ephah for the ram, and for the lambs as his means suffice, and a hin of oil to an ephah. Ezekiel 46:7. Rabbi Shimon says, is the measure of the meal offering accompanying bulls and rams the same, as stated in this verse, that it is an ephah for each? In fact, this is not the halakha, as the meal offering accompanying a bull is 3/10 of an ephah of fine flour. See Numbers 15:9. Whereas the meal offering accompanying a ram is only 2/10 of an ephah. See Numbers 15:6. Rather, the verse teaches that if the temple treasurers had sufficient funds for the numerous bulls that are required to be sacrificed on that day, but they did not also have sufficient funds for the accompanying libations, they should bring one bull and its libations, and they should not sacrifice all of them without libations. And similarly, if the temple treasurers had sufficient funds for, all right, 45b, that would be the back of the page, or the second part of the page. All right, so if the temple treasurers had sufficient funds for, okay, 45b, the numerous rams that are required to be sacrificed on that day, and they did not also have sufficient funds for the ephah, i.e. the prescribed measure of flour for all of the rams, they should bring one ram and its ephah of flour, and they should not sacrifice all of them without their ephahs of flour. Mishnah. On Shavuot, there is an obligation to sacrifice burnt offerings, a sin offering, and peace offerings together with the offering of the 2 loaves. The burnt offerings consist of a bull, 2 rams, and 7 sheep. A goat is brought for the sin offering. 2 sheep are brought as peace offerings and waved together with the 2 loaves. Failure to sacrifice the bull, the rams, and the sheep, which are all brought as burnt offerings, and the goat that is brought as a sin offering, does not prevent the bringing of the 2 loaves, and they are sacrificed nevertheless. Failure to bring the 2 loaves does not prevent sacrifice of the accompanying animal offerings. Failure to bring the 2 loaves prevents the sacrifice of the accompanying peace offering of 2 sheep. But failure to sacrifice the 2 sheep does not prevent the bringing of the 2 loaves. This is the statement of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Shimon ben Nanas says, no, rather the opposite is true. Failure to sacrifice the peace offering of 2 sheep prevents the bringing of the 2 loaves, but failure to bring the 2 loaves does not prevent sacrifice of the accompanying peace offerings of 2 sheep. As we found that when the Jewish people were in the wilderness for 40 years after the exodus from Egypt, they sacrificed the 2 sheep as a peace offering on Shavuot without the 2 loaves, as the 2 loaves may be brought only from wheat grown in Eretz Yisrael after the Jewish people entered the land. Here too, whenever wheat is unavailable, they should sacrifice the 2 sheep without the 2 loaves. However, the 2 loaves are not sacrificed without the peace offering of 2 sheep. Rabbi Shimon says, the halakha is in accordance with the statement of Rabbi Shimon ben Nanas. That failure to sacrifice the 2 sheep prevents the bringing of the 2 loaves, but failure to bring the 2 loaves does not prevent sacrifice of the accompanying peace offerings of 2 sheep. But the reason for that ruling is not in accordance with his statement. As all the offerings that must be sacrificed on Shavuot that are stated in the book of Numbers, see chapter 28, verse 27, i.e., 2 bulls, 1 ram, and 7 sheep as additional offerings, and a goat as a sin offering, were sacrificed when the Jewish people were in the wilderness. But all the offerings stated in Leviticus, see 23, 18 through 20, i.e. the offerings accompanying the 2 loaves, were not sacrificed when the Jewish people were in the wilderness. Not only were the 2 loaves not sacrificed, but the accompanying offerings, including the peace offering of the 2 sheep, were also not sacrificed, because it was only when they arrived in Eretz Yisrael that these additional offerings and those offerings accompanying the 2 loaves were sacrificed. neither the additional offerings of Shavuot nor the 2 loaves and the offerings that accompanied them were sacrificed in the wilderness, contrary to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Nanas. Rather, for what reason do I nevertheless say that the sheep should be sacrificed without the loaves? In accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Nanas, it is due to the fact that the sheep permit themselves, as the sprinkling of their blood and the burning of the portions consumed on the altar renders it permitted to partake of their meat. And why are the loaves not sacrificed without the sheep? It is because there is no item to permit the loaves, as the loaves are permitted only after the sheep are sacrificed. Gemara. The Mishnah teaches the halakot of the sacrifices that generally accompany the 2 loaves on Shavuot in a case when the 2 loaves are not available. The Gemara cites a relevant bereta. The sages taught, the verse that mandates these offerings states, "And you shall sacrifice with the bread 7 lambs without blemish of the first year, and 1 young bull, and 2 rams." Leviticus 23:18. The phrase, "and you shall sacrifice with the bread," indicates that it is obligatory to sacrifice these burnt offerings with the loaves of bread. And if the loaves are not available, then these offerings are not sacrificed. The continuation of the verse, 7 lambs without blemish, teaches that the lambs are sacrificed even if there are no loaves available. If so that the animal offerings may be sacrificed even without loaves, what is the meaning when the verse states, "with the bread"? It teaches that they were not obligated to sacrifice the sheep before they were obligated to sacrifice loaves, i.e., they became obligated to sacrifice all of these offerings only when they entered Eretz Yisrael. This is the statement of Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Akiva states, one might have thought that the sheep mentioned here in Leviticus, which accompany the 2 loaves, are the very same ones mentioned in the book of Numbers. See 28:27. In the passage prescribing the additional offerings, you must say when you reach the bulls and rams that are enumerated in the 2 passages that the offerings mentioned in one are not those mentioned in the other, as the number of bulls and rams are not equal. Whereas in Leviticus the verse requires the sacrifice of 1 bull and 2 rams, in Numbers the verse requires the sacrifice of 2 bulls and 1 ram. Rather, the 2 passages are referring to 2 different things. These mentioned in Numbers come upon the altar for their own sake, and those mentioned in Leviticus come upon the altar for the sake of the 2 loaves. It is therefore found that the offerings that are mentioned in the book of Numbers were sacrificed even when the Jewish people were in the wilderness and could not bring the offering of the 2 loaves. But the offerings that are mentioned in Leviticus were not sacrificed in the wilderness, due to the fact that the 2 loaves could not be sacrificed in the wilderness. The Gemara challenges, but perhaps the bulls and rams mentioned in Numbers are not those mentioned in Leviticus, but the sheep mentioned in Numbers are the same as those mentioned in Leviticus. The Gemara explains, from the fact that these bulls and rams are different, it is apparent that those sheep are also different offerings. The Gemara asks, but from where is it proven that the bulls and rams in Numbers are different offerings than the bulls and rams mentioned in Leviticus? Perhaps they are actually the same offerings. And this is what the Merciful One is saying. If you want, sacrifice a bull and 2 rams, as the verse states in Leviticus. And if you want, sacrifice 2 bulls and 1 ram, as the verse states in Numbers. The Gemara answers, from the fact that the order of the offerings is different in the 2 passages, as the verse in Leviticus mentions the sheep, then the bull, and then the rams, whereas the verse in Numbers mentions the bulls, then the ram, and then the sheep. One may conclude from it that they are different offerings. The Mishnah teaches, failure to bring the 2 loaves prevents sacrifice of the accompanying peace offerings of 2 sheep. But failure to sacrifice the 2 sheep does not prevent the bringing of the 2 loaves. This is the statement of Rabbi Akiva. The Gemara asks, what is the reasoning of Rabbi Akiva? The Gemara answers, he derived the halakha based upon a verbal analogy between 2 verses. One verse states, and the priest shall wave them with the bread of the first fruits for a wave offering before the Lord, with the 2 lambs. They shall be Yehiyu, holy to the Lord for the priest. Leviticus 23:20. The term they shall be indicates that it is essential that the offering be brought precisely as commanded, but it is unclear whether this is referring to the loaves or to the sheep brought as peace offerings. This is clarified by means of a verbal analogy from the verse. You shall bring out your dwellings 2 loaves. You shall bring out of your dwellings 2 loaves of waving of 2/10 parts of an ephah. They shall be tahiena of fine flour. Leviticus 23:17. The verbal analogy teaches that just as there, the requirement that it be done as prescribed is referring to the loaves rather than to the sheep, so too here, it is referring to the loaves rather than the sheep. Consequently, failure to bring the loaves prevents sacrifice of the sheep, but failure to sacrifice the sheep does not prevent the bringing of the loaves. The Gemara asks, and how did Rabbi Shimon ben Nanas, who holds that failure to sacrifice the sheep prevents the bringing of the loaves, but failure to bring the loaves does not prevent sacrifice of the sheep, derive his ruling? He derived the halakha through a verbal analogy between the verse. They shall be, Yehiyu, holy to the Lord for the priest. And the verse that states concerning the 7 sheep brought as burnt offerings, they shall be, Yehiyu, a burnt offering to the Lord. Leviticus 23:18. Just as there, the requirement that it be done as prescribed is referring to the sheep, so too here it is referring to sheep rather than loaves. The Gemara challenges, and according to Rabbi Shimon ben Nanas also, we should derive the halakha based upon a verbal analogy from the word tahina, as Rabbi Akiva does, and conclude that just as there, it is referring to the loaves, so too here, it is referring to the loaves. The Gemara responds, it is preferable to derive the meaning of the term Yehiyu from a verbal analogy using the identical form Yehiyu, and one should not derive the meaning of the term Yehiyu from a verbal analogy using the term Tahina. The Gemara asks, what difference is there whether or not the words are identical? Didn't the school of Rabbi Yishmael teach a verbal analogy with regard to leprosy of houses? The verse states, and the priest shall return, Veshav, on the seventh day. Leviticus 14:39. And another verse with regard to the priest's visit 7 days later states, and the priest shall come, Uva, and look. Leviticus 14:44. This returning and this coming have the same meaning, and one can therefore derive by verbal analogy that the halakha, which applies if the leprosy had spread at the conclusion of the first week, likewise applies if it had spread at the end of the following week. Which applies if the leprosy had spread at the conclusion of the first week, likewise applies if it had spread again by the end of the following week. Certainly, if the halakha can be derived via a verbal analogy with the words Veshav and Uva, the even slighter difference in form between Yihyu and Tahina should not prevent the application of a verbal analogy. The Gemara answers, this matter applies only when there are no terms that are identical to it. But where there are terms that are identical to it, we derive the verbal analogy from terms identical to it, rather than from the terms that are not precisely identical. Consequently, it is preferable to derive the meaning of the term Yihyu from the identical term rather than from Tahina. The Gemara challenges, and let Rabbi Akiva also derive the meaning of the term Yihyu from a verbal analogy to the identical term Yihyu as Rabbi Shimon ben Nanas does. The Gemara responds, Rabbi Akiva holds that it is preferable to derive the halakha concerning an item that is given as a gift to the priest, such as the loaves or the sheep brought as peace offerings, which are the subject of Leviticus 23:20, from the halakha concerning an item that is also a gift to the priest, i.e. the 2 loaves, which are the subject of Leviticus 23:17. This is to the exclusion of these 7 sheep that are mentioned in Leviticus 23:18, which are burnt offerings and wholly consumed by the altar, and are not a gift to the priest. Consequently, it is preferable to derive the meaning of the term Yihyu in verse 20 from the term Tahina in verse 17, rather than from the term Yihyu in verse 18. The Gemara presents an alternative explanation for the basis of their divergent opinions. And if you wish, say instead that they disagree about the interpretation of the verse itself. They shall be Yihyu, holy to the Lord for the priest. Leviticus 23:20. Rabbi Akiva holds, which item is entirely given to the priest? You must say that it is the loaves of bread. Therefore he concludes that the word Yihyu is referring to the loaves of bread, and if they are not sacrificed, the 2 sheep cannot be sacrificed as peace offerings. The Gemara asks, And how would Rabbi Shimon ben Nanas respond to this? He would say, it is in fact written, they shall be, Yehu, holy for the priest. In which case one should interpret it as Rabbi Akiva does. It is written in the verse, they shall be Yehu holy to the Lord for the priest. Therefore it should be understood in the following manner. Which item is partially given to the Lord and partially given to the priest? You must say that it is the sheep, which are sacrificed as a peace offering, part of which is burned on the altar, and part of which is consumed by the priest. Consequently, the word Yehu should be understood as referring to the sheep, and if they are not sacrificed, the 2 loaves cannot be sacrificed either. The Gemara asks, and how would Rabbi Akiva respond to this? He would say, it is in fact written, they shall be, Yehu, holy for the Lord and for the priest. It is written in the verse, they shall be, Yehu, holy to the Lord for the priest. Therefore, it should be understood to mean that it is given to the Lord, and it is then given by him entirely to the priest, in accordance with the statement of Rav Huna. As Rav Huna says, the Lord acquired it initially and then gave it to the priest. With regard to the dispute in the Mishnah about whether failure to sacrifice the 2 sheep as peace offerings prevents the bringing of the 2 loaves or vice versa, Rabbi Yohanan says everyone concedes. That ends Menachot 45. Thank you.